Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Applied Forensic Psychology podcast. Today we're going to be talking about a case that involved 4 wrongful convictions in 1974 and also Canada's first post-mortem conviction review. Today we are here with
Emmy Hickey,
Reese Crocker, and Kalia Johnson.
And first we're just going to go over what the case was, so Emmy's going to start us off.
So, in 1974, Russell Woodhouse was convicted of manslaughter for the death of a Winnipeg man that happened in 1973. The victim was Ting Fong Chan, a 40-year-old father of 2, who was stabbed and beaten to death near a downtown Winnipeg construction site. So, Russell was tried alongside Alan Woodhouse, who received 23 years for murder, Clarence Woodhouse, who received 12 years for murder, Brian Anderson, who received 11 years for murder, and Russell Woodhouse received 10 years for manslaughter. They received these sentences despite only being ages 17 to 21 at the time.
So there were eyewitness accounts mentioning Indigenous people, which led the police to target the men in the first place. One witness living near where the body was found reported awakening early in the morning, who she believed were Indigenous because, I quote, they had shoulder-length hair and some were wearing headbands, which led her to believe that they were Indigenous people, and there was other witnesses that believed that as well. Another told the police he was about 2 blocks away from where the body was found, but at the trial, the man said he was not sure about that day and what happened in the court.
The central evidence in the Crown's case was written confessions that the men allegedly provided to police. So the men didn't speak a lot of English, but the confessions were written fluently in English. And all 4 men later testified that they were assaulted and coerced into giving a confession, and that they didn't actually write these confessions themselves, which does make sense considering that they weren't fluent in English. The jury was all white, and the trial judge dismissed all the claims of police brutality and accepted the confessions as voluntary.
So, given the generalizations made by the eyewitness in combination with the coercive tactics that the Winnipeg police were using, especially given the fact that they were quite young at the time, that resulted in the 4 of them confessing to their various crimes, whether that was the murder or the manslaughter.
Since also they barely spoke English and the confessions were written in fluent English, that brings up the question of, was it actually their own confessions? Questionability of the accuracy of the confessions themselves. With the combination of these, it also led the jury to have a biased stance when they were listening to testimonies, and especially the defense.
Yeah, and we're going to get into more of their exonerations later, but when lawyers were reviewing the case, they actually said that one of the lawyers said, quote, "What was particularly unsettling about this prosecution was that the racism was there from the beginning to the end, from the moment of the police investigation to the moment of their conviction and sentencing." So not only did an eyewitness say because they had shoulder-length hair and were wearing some headbands, and they just assumed that these people were Indigenous, but another told police that they heard, quote, "a lot of Indians fighting and yelling about a block or 2 away from where Chan's body was found." But then the man also said he was, quote, "not sure at all." So that just kind of goes to show you that this was a conviction with 4 convictions with very little evidence. In court, Russell Woodhouse was assessed as being mildly developmentally disabled, and experts testified they didn't think he could have provided the detailed statement that police claimed he did, which, again, was written in English and was signed by him. So there was a lot of things in this case that led to all 4 sentences, and none of them were correct evidence. Now we're going to talk about their exoneration and how that came to be.
So, in 2023, Russell's sister, Linda Anderson, applied for a conviction review with the support of Innocence Canada. So, Russell actually passed away in 2011 because of cancer, but his family still continued to pursue the case. First, in July of 2023, Brian Anderson and Alan Woodhouse were exonerated. Shortly after that, in October of 2023, Clarence Woodhouse was exonerated. And then lastly, Russell Woodhouse was.
So this is controversial for a number of reasons. Some people believe that he should be able to have his name cleared even if he is no longer alive. Some people believe that it was a waste of resources. But it really does go to the question of what is the justice system for? What is crime and its punishment supposed to do? Is it solely to punish the person who convicted the crime, in which case it would be, I guess, a waste of resources since there's no way to take back the punishment that he served in prison? Or is it truly to create a sense of who a person is to society, warn people of the dangers that each person poses, in which it would be important to clear his name because he is a key model of society in the future of post-mortem convictions and what it means to have those.
And I think when we look at the justice system, especially when we think about Gladue principles and being sensitive with Indigenous people, this case just really does stand out since 4 Indigenous people were convicted without good reason. And I think that having a post-mortem case conviction review, even if someone is dead, that sort of review when there was such deep systemic racism in the case, I think does make a difference. I think if the case was obviously less complicated and had less deep racism involved in it, it would be a different thing. But I think that just because we can base new convictions off of these and learn from it, that's why it was our first, in Canada, our first post-mortem conviction review since the evidence was basically zero. And what does suck is that he spent his whole life being known as a murderer. Mm-hmm. Or he was charged with manslaughter. If you have that title or criminal record, it does affect you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and I just think in terms of doing this post-mortem conviction review, it's important to think about the person who was wrongfully convicted, but just looking at their family, how that would impact their family, their community, their friends around them, if they have any children, thinking that someone who they were close with or someone in their community was a murderer or did take somebody's life. And I think it's almost a form of kind of restorative justice for that family, just being able to clear Russell's name even though he's no longer there. I'm sure that was incredibly important to them and their community.
And along with what Leah already said, like establishing the danger of stereotypes in minorities and how that can affect different situations in the justice system, and the importance of righting those wrongs that already happened so that we can go forward with those in mind, because if you don't correct history, then you're bound to repeat it. However, some people still believe that it's controversial that they use these resources to get his name cleared, because in this case there actually was no convicted person found of this murder. Even after the exoneration, to this day, there's no one found, so some people may still believe that they were guilty and that they did get off. However, they still spent so much of their lives from such a young age dealing with the consequences of this now proven to be false conviction.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's one thing being convicted as guilty and spending the rest of your life in prison, but it's another thing being convicted guilty and you weren't the one who did the crime, and for you to clear your name and be offered $7 million after wasting most of your life in prison and not being able to get that time back is also a big thing.
So right now the city of Winnipeg is actually proposing a $7 million payment toward a global settlement to compensate the 3 men wrongfully convicted. So obviously these 3 men would be the 3 that are still here with us. Russell Woodhouse did die in 2011 from cancer. So I think that is important to note because the 3 men that are still alive were exonerated in 2023 to 2024-ish. If they are given this huge payment, this would actually be the first time that a major financial settlement for a wrongful conviction would happen, I think, in Canada. That would be really interesting to see. And I think that that's another thing to say is once you get wrongfully convicted and then exonerated, that doesn't really give you back the years on your life.
And it might, like, clear your name, but, like, again, like, you still have all the background opinions of what everybody was talking about. And, like, so getting a job or, like, things like that might be a lot more difficult for someone who did get exonerated, like, with all those opinions from everybody else, like...
Yeah, and I just think no amount of money could kind of compensate for the amount of time you would have spent in prison away from your family, like, outside of your community, and also not working. Like, if we're just looking at it from a monetary perspective, any kind of money you could make from that would very likely not amass to what you could have been doing outside of prison, and the fact that going back into the workforce after prison, like you mentioned, would not be easy. But just thinking about kind of the life that takes away from you that you can't get back, I just don't think we can kind of make that equal with money. It's almost just more of a formality as opposed to
what I was also thinking, this is kind of random, but he was diagnosed with cancer, and I think that that's spending like 10 years of your life behind bars and then getting like your life kind of cut short because of that, and you were wrongfully convicted. That's just like a bad hand of cards, and then the government does need to do something about that. And I think that in like a post-mortem review for stuff like this is honestly necessary, because while yes, these courts can be occupied with other things because people are waiting for cases, but this is, there is such an overrepresentation of Indigenous people incarcerated in Canada. So, I mean, if I was a family member of someone who was wrongfully convicted, I feel like, alive or dead, I would still want those years back, some sort of recognition, and just like a claim of innocence,
Because this trial was very much, like, not based on the facts and the proof and everything. It was based on, like, opinions and biases that everybody had. So just the fact that he was convicted of manslaughter and then got dealt the cancer card.
I just think given that this entire trial had such a preventable outcome if things had been thought through more, I feel like this kind of post-mortem reconsideration, like conviction review, is like the least that can be done for that family.
I think that having one too will make people read about it and be like, oh, okay, there is systemic racism in Canada, and I think that just having stuff like this come out is part of reconciliation and just something that we have to do.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's important to be having conversations like this, because naturally, even within the applied forensic psych community, just talking about any kind of post-mortem conviction review, like given that this is the first one in Canada, it's not a super heard of thing. I don't think it's like particularly well understood, coming from my perspective at least. Outside of this case, I've never really heard of anything similar, even outside of Canada. So just kind of understanding that that is an option, even if people don't necessarily understand why, just kind of talking about it specifically in terms of this trial, I think is just a great way to kind of educate people on different issues within the justice system.
And I think it took us, like, even before we started here today, it took us a good 30 minutes just to kind of understand this case and why it was the first time they did a review like this. And it was genuinely just because this case was a wrongdoing of justice. And in that case, I think that this should be done. And I wonder how many other people have relatives who have passed that are upset because they passed being convicted of something that they didn't do.
Yeah, it definitely opens a new door for people that are going through similar situations, and people don't, like, it never happens, so a lot of people outside of that don't think, oh, this is important because it happens so much, but really, it probably does.
Yeah.
And false confessions and false convictions happen a lot more then people realize, and it's important to get justice for the people that weren't sometimes alive to do so.
Yeah, or even were in a vulnerable position at the time of
Right.
of being coerced into a confession.
Also knowing your resources too, like Russell Woodhouse's sister, she went through Innocence Canada project to take the next step for them to get exonerated as well. So they helped out with that too. So just knowing like there are many resources out there if you do believe that someone is being wrongfully convicted and things like that, or just resources for yourself, there is that possibility as well.
I'm Emmy.
I'm Reese.
I'm Kalia.
And I'm Leah, and that's it for the podcast for today. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.